Hello and welcome. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Shifting Picture. When Anna received the old painting in the mail, she hadn't expected much. Her Aunt Margaret, an eccentric woman who had passed away 2 weeks prior, had left it to her in her will. Anna barely remembered her, and their only interaction had been at a family reunion years ago. Still, the note from the estate's executor was clear. To my niece Anna, I leave the painting that has watched over me for years. She leaned the package against her living room wall and stared at it. The frame was massive, carved from dark wood with intricate details that looked almost alive in the flickering light of her single lamp. Anna tore the paper off, revealing the painting beneath. At first glance, the image was nothing extraordinary, just a quiet forest scene. A narrow dirt path cut through tall, shadowy trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into a dim, foggy horizon. The colors were muted, almost dreamlike, with pale greens and soft grays blending together. Something about it felt off. The path seemed to twist unnaturally, leading the eye deeper into the painting, and the shadows between the trees were darker than they should have been, almost black. "Creepy," Anna muttered, setting it against the wall. She debated throwing it out, but a pang of guilt stopped her. Margaret must have valued it, or she wouldn't have left it to her. Shrugging, she decided to leave it for now. Maybe she could sell it later. That night, Anna sat in bed scrolling through her phone, her thoughts drifting back to the painting. She hadn't liked how it made her feel. It was just a picture, but it had an almost tangible presence, as if it were watching her. Shaking her head, she turned off the light and burrowed under the covers. The sound of something creaking woke her in the middle of the night. Her apartment was old, and the walls had a tendency to groan as they settled, but this noise was different, sharp, deliberate. She listened, her heart pounding. Another creak, closer this time. Slowly, she sat up and turned on her bedside lamp. The sound stopped. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but then curiosity got the better of her. She slipped out of bed, grabbing her phone for light, and padded into the living room. Her breath caught in her throat. The painting was no longer where she had left it. It now hung on the wall opposite the couch, perfectly centered, as if it had always been there. Anna froze, her mind racing. She was certain she hadn't hung it up. She hadn't even touched a hammer or nails. But there it was, staring back at her with its eerie forest scene. Only something was different. The path in the painting wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Anna stepped closer, her heart thundering. The figure was faint, almost blending into the shadows, but it was unmistakable, a person, their features obscured by the gloom. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Nope," she whispered, turning on every light in the room. She grabbed the painting off the wall, planning to toss it into the storage closet, but as her fingers touched the frame, she hesitated. The wood was warm, almost as if it were alive. A low hum seemed to vibrate beneath her fingertips. She yanked her hands away and stumbled back. The figure in the painting had moved. It was no longer at the edge of the trees. Now it stood halfway down the path, its outline sharper, though the face was still hidden in shadow. Anna felt bile rise in her throat. "What the hell?" she muttered, backing away. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do not look away from it." Her breath hitched. She spun around, expecting to see someone in the room, but she was alone. The phone buzzed again. "If you look away, it will come closer." Anna's knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, her eyes glued to the painting. The figure hadn't moved again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone broken in and set this up? "Who are you?" she typed back, her fingers trembling. The reply came almost instantly. "It doesn't matter. Just keep your eyes on the painting." She wanted to scream. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Against her better judgment, she glanced away for just a second, long enough to check the locks on her door. When she looked back, the figure was at the edge of the frame. Anna let out a strangled gasp. She scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp. The shadowy figure's outline was sharper now, its face still a blur, but its body unmistakably humanoid. It was as though it were trying to step out of the painting. Her phone buzzed again. You looked away. It's too late now. The lights flickered. Panic clawed at her chest as the room seemed to grow colder. She grabbed the painting, desperate to throw it out, to burn it, to do anything to rid herself of it. But as soon as her hands touched the frame, she felt it again, that strange warmth, the vibration under her fingers. She tried to lift it, but it wouldn't budge, as if it were bolted to the wall. "Get out of my house," she screamed, her voice cracking. The figure in the painting moved. It turned its head toward her, and for the first time, she saw its face, or what was left of it. Its features were grotesque, twisted beyond recognition, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Anna stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat before snapping back on. The painting was empty. The forest scene remained, but the path was deserted. The figure was gone. Anna's breath came in ragged gasps as she scanned the room, every shadow seeming to stretch and shift. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she tried to call someone, anyone. A creak came from behind her. Slowly she turned. Standing in the doorway to her bedroom was the figure from the painting. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Anna felt her legs give out, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to tear her gaze away. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, the sound of its footsteps echoing in the silent room. Anna scrambled backward on the floor, her hands clawing at the carpet as the figure advanced. It moved with an unnatural grace, its feet barely seeming to touch the ground. Though its face was twisted and hollow, Anna felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on her, as if it could see straight through her. "Stay away," she screamed, her voice breaking. She grabbed the first thing within reach, a small vase from the coffee table, and hurled it at the figure. The vase shattered on impact, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it paused, tilting its head slightly, as though mocking her attempt to fight back. Her phone buzzed again, and against her better judgment, she glanced at the screen. "It's part of you now. You can't get rid of it." "No!" Anna screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You're lying. This isn't real." She looked back at the figure, and in that brief moment, its face had changed. The twisted features were still there, but now they looked familiar. She gasped as she recognized the hollowed remnants of her own face staring back at her. The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, and pointed toward the painting. Anna's head whipped around. The forest scene had shifted again. The path was no longer empty. She saw herself in the painting, standing on the trail, her expression frozen in terror. The trees around her seemed to close in, their dark branches stretching toward her painted form like skeletal fingers. "No, no, no," Anna whispered, clutching her head. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and the room spun around her. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the figure. It didn't move. It simply stood there, pointing at the painting. Anna's mind raced. If she couldn't destroy it, maybe she could hide it, lock it away somewhere, bury it, anything to break whatever hold it had over her. With a surge of adrenaline, she leapt to her feet and grabbed the painting. This time, it came off the wall easily, the strange warmth still radiating from the frame. She ignored it, sprinting toward the front door. The hallway outside her apartment was eerily silent. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Anna didn't stop to think. She ran down the corridor, clutching the painting tightly against her chest. The elevator at the end of the hall was too far, so she turned toward the stairwell instead, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete steps. She didn't hear footsteps, but she could feel it. The figure was following her. The air grew heavier with each step, a suffocating pressure that made it harder to breathe. By the time she reached the building's basement, her legs were shaking and her chest burned from exertion. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb swinging from the ceiling. It cast long, shifting shadows that made her stomach churn. She spotted an old storage room in the corner, its door hanging slightly ajar, and stumbled toward it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Rusted shelves lined the walls, stacked with forgotten boxes and broken furniture. Anna shoved the painting into a corner, grabbing an old tarp to cover it. Her hands trembled as she piled heavy boxes on top, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She stepped back, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Stay there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're not coming back with me." As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed in the small room, making her jump. She spun around, but the painting was still buried beneath the tarp and boxes. Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in the dark. It's never that easy. Anna dropped the phone with a cry, backing into the door. Her fingers fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room began to shift, coiling like living things. A cold wind brushed past her, though there were no windows. She turned back toward the painting, dread pooling in her stomach. The boxes began to move, sliding off the tarp one by one, as if an invisible hand were brushing them aside. The tarp fluttered, revealing the painting beneath it. Anna's heart sank as she saw the image. The path was gone. The trees were gone. Now, the painting depicted the storage room she was standing in, every detail perfectly captured. And in the center of the painted room stood the figure. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't happening." She clawed at the door, her nails scraping against the wood, but it was no use. The painting began to glow faintly, the light growing brighter and brighter until it filled the entire room. Anna covered her eyes, tears streaming down her face. When the light faded, she found herself standing in the middle of the forest. The air was damp and cold, the ground beneath her bare feet soft with moss. She spun around, her breath visible in the frigid air. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. It echoed back to her, thin and distorted. The path stretched out in front of her, the same one from the painting. She realized with a sinking feeling that she had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. Slowly, she began to walk, the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet the only sound. The further she went, the darker it became. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, whispering faintly in a language she couldn't understand. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest. The path began to twist and turn in impossible ways, looping back on itself, but she kept moving. Ahead, she saw a faint light. She broke into a run, desperate for any sign of escape. As she neared the source, she realized it was a clearing. In the center stood an easel, and on it was the painting. But this time, the image was of her own living room. The figure stood in the center, staring directly at her. Anna's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen was blank, but a voice echoed from the speaker, low and distorted. "You can't escape. You're part of the picture now." The easel began to glow, the light pulling her forward. She tried to resist, but her feet moved on their own, dragging her closer and closer. The light enveloped her, and she screamed as she felt herself being pulled into the canvas. Anna's scream echoed into nothingness as the light swallowed her whole. For a moment, there was only silence, a suffocating, endless void. Then she felt a jolt, as though she had been dropped from a great height. The world reassembled around her, piece by piece, but it wasn't the world she knew. She stood back in her apartment, or what looked like it. The furniture was all there, arranged exactly as she'd left it, but the colors were muted, washed out like an old photograph. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and her movements were slow, as though she were wading through water. The painting hung on the wall, dominating the room. Its frame seemed larger now, the wood darker, the carvings more intricate. The forest scene was gone, replaced by an image of the very room she was standing in. But something was wrong. In the painted version of her living room, the figure was sitting on her couch. Anna turned slowly, her stomach twisting into knots. The couch behind her was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting ever so slightly. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but her hands moved on their own, pulling the device from her pocket. "Do you see it yet?" The words made her skin crawl. Her hands shook as she typed back, desperate for answers. "What do you want from me?" The reply came instantly. "You're the one who kept looking." Anna let out a strangled laugh, a sound that was more panic than humor. "Looking at what?" "At you." "I didn't ask for this," she yelled, her voice echoing unnaturally in the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, pooling like ink. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. She stumbled toward the window, hoping for some glimpse of the outside world, some sign of reality. But when she pulled back the curtain, she saw only darkness. It wasn't the night sky or the dim glow of streetlights. It was an empty void, endless and oppressive. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection staring back at her. Then slowly, her reflection began to change. The Anna in the glass didn't move as she did. Its eyes darkened, the whites turning black. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile, one that stretched too wide and revealed too many teeth. She stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling hard onto the floor. Her head throbbed, but the pain was quickly overshadowed by the sound of creaking wood. The painting, it was changing again. She forced herself to look, dread sinking into her bones. The figure in the painting was gone. The living room it depicted was empty now, except for the reflection in the window. Her reflection. Anna's body felt like it was made of lead, but she forced herself to her feet. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this. I'm not playing your game." She grabbed the painting, intending to smash it, to break the glass or rip the canvas. But the moment her fingers touched the frame, she felt it again, that warmth, that pulsing energy. It flowed through her, rooting her in place. The painted version of the room began to shift again. This time, the shadows came alive, swirling and coiling like smoke. They poured out of the painting, spilling into the real world. Anna screamed as the darkness engulfed her, cold and suffocating, wrapping around her limbs like chains. From within the shadows, a voice emerged, low and rasping. "You can't destroy what you've become." "No!" Anna cried, struggling against the darkness. "I'm not part of this. I'm not part of you." The shadows tightened, and for a moment, she thought they would crush her. But then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they retreated, slithering back into the painting. Anna collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up, her eyes darting to the painting. It was still now, the image frozen. But the scene it depicted was no longer her living room. It was her. She was inside the painting, standing on the forest path, her face twisted in terror. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Anna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "That's not real. That's not me." Her phone buzzed one last time. "You're only seeing the beginning." The screen went black. Anna stared at the painting, her reflection in its glass surface merging with the twisted version of herself inside. The room around her began to dissolve, the walls crumbling into darkness. She felt herself falling again, the world spinning out of control. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the forest. The path stretched before her, endless and unyielding. The whispers in the shadows grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. She turned in every direction, but there was no escape. And then she saw it. The figure stood at the end of the path, its hollow eyes gleaming. It raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Anna took a step, her body moving against her will. Then another. The forest closed in around her, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching out like claws. The figure waited, patient and unrelenting, and Anna walked toward it. Anna's footsteps echoed in the forest, though the ground beneath her was soft and damp. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was dragging her down. The figure at the end of the path didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting. Its hollow eyes seemed to pull her forward, their gaze an unspoken command she couldn't resist. No, she whispered to herself, though the word felt meaningless. Her lips trembled as she tried to fight whatever force was guiding her body. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the cold bite of the air, the rough bark of the trees she brushed against, the weight in her chest, it all felt far too real. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stop, digging her heels into the mossy ground. For a moment, she managed to hold herself in place. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if in curiosity, and then the path beneath her began to ripple. The ground moved like water, ripples spreading outward from where she stood. Her feet sank into the moss, and she let out a cry as she was pulled downward, the earth swallowing her up to her ankles. She twisted and thrashed, trying to free herself, but it was no use. The figure raised its hand, and the rippling stopped, leaving her trapped. "Why are you doing this to me?" Anna shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and deepening. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with an eerie, discordant hum. They weren't just coming from the trees anymore. They were inside her head, circling her thoughts like vultures. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands to her ears. "Stop it," she screamed. "Get out of my head." The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, merging into a single voice. It was low and guttural, each word vibrating through her bones. "You look too long." Anna's eyes snapped open, and she gasped. The figure was no longer at the end of the path. It was right in front of her. She stumbled backward, falling onto the damp ground. The shadows around the figure writhed like living things, coiling and uncoiling in unnatural patterns. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice shaking. "Go back to wherever you came from." The figure tilted its head again, and for the first time it spoke. Its voice was a rasping whisper, like dry leaves scraping against each other. "You brought me here." "No, I didn't," Anna said, shaking her head. "I didn't ask for any of this." "You opened the door," the figure replied. "You let me in." Tears streamed down Anna's face as she tried to make sense of the words. "The painting," she muttered. "This all started with the painting." The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stretched out its hand toward her. Long, thin fingers extended from the sleeve of its dark cloak, and Anna recoiled at the sight of them. They were unnaturally long, the joints bending at odd angles, the skin pale and translucent. "Stay away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the ground. "I won't let you take me." But the figure didn't stop. Its hand reached for her, and she felt the air grow colder as its fingers brushed against her arm. The touch burned like ice, and she let out a scream, the pain shooting through her like 1,000 needles. The forest around her began to change. The trees twisted and warped, their branches reaching downward like grasping hands. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, filling her ears with unintelligible words. She clutched her head, her vision blurring as the world spun around her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went still. Anna opened her eyes and gasped. She was no longer in the forest. She was back in her apartment, lying on the floor. Her breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling with each panicked breath. She looked around, her eyes darting to every corner of the room. The painting was gone. For a brief, fleeting moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe she had escaped. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the ache in her muscles. Her phone lay on the coffee table, and she hesitated before picking it up. The screen was dark, the device silent. She let out a shaky breath. "It's over," she whispered to herself. "It's finally over." But as she turned toward the window, her heart sank. The reflection in the glass wasn't her own. It was the figure, its hollow eyes staring back at her. She froze, unable to look away. The reflection raised its hand, pointing toward the wall where the painting had once hung. Anna turned slowly, her stomach churning. The wall was bare, except for a single black smear, as though the painting had burned itself into the surface. The smear began to spread, creeping outward like ink and water. Shapes formed within it, shifting and twisting until they became clear. It was the forest, and in the center of the scene stood Anna, her face frozen in a silent scream. The shadows in the room began to move, crawling across the floor toward her. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest, and she felt the pull again, that same unrelenting force that had dragged her into the painting before. "No," she whispered, backing away. "Not again." But the shadows didn't stop. They wrapped around her ankles, climbing up her legs, pulling her toward the wall. She clawed at the floor, screaming, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the painting on the wall, her own terrified face staring back at her. And then there was nothing. Anna's consciousness flickered back into existence like a faint light struggling against overwhelming darkness. When she opened her eyes, she found herself standing in the forest once more. This time it was different. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper, and the trees seemed to lean closer together, their gnarled branches forming a cage around her. The path ahead was barely visible, winding into an oppressive black void. Her body ached, as if it had been twisted and reshaped to fit this place. She looked down at her hands, trembling and pale, her nails cracked and stained with dirt. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. "Is this death?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the eerie silence of the forest. But she knew it wasn't. Death would have been a release, an escape from the nightmare she had been pulled into. This was something else entirely, a prison, a realm that existed outside of time and space, and she was trapped in it. From somewhere deep within the forest, a sound broke the silence, the crunch of footsteps on the brittle ground. Anna froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was deliberate, heavy, and slow, moving toward her. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then the voice returned, low and rasping, like the rustle of dead leaves. "You don't belong here." Anna turned in every direction, searching for the source of the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing through the trees and reverberating in her mind. "Why me?" she cried, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me? I didn't ask for this." The voice didn't answer. Instead, the shadows began to move, swirling and coalescing into a shape just a few feet away from her. It was the figure again, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. This time, it seemed larger, more imposing, its presence filling the space around it like a living void. Anna took a step back, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. "Stay away from me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I don't want this. I didn't mean to." "You look too long," the figure interrupted, its voice cutting through her like a blade. "You saw what you were not meant to see. And now you are part of it." "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. Ignorance does not absolve you. The figure took a step closer, and Anna felt the air grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that her breath turned to visible mist. You chose to keep looking. You chose to stay. And now you will remain. The words sent a wave of despair crashing over her. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. There has to be a way out. There has to be something I can do. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. The shadows around it writhed and twisted, their movements hypnotic and unnatural. There is no escape, it said finally. This place is yours now, and you are its. No, Anna screamed, her voice raw with desperation. I won't accept that. I won't let you take my life. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward like a tidal wave, enveloping Anna completely. She screamed as the darkness closed in around her, suffocating and cold. She tried to fight, to claw her way free, but it was no use. The shadows were relentless, pulling her deeper and deeper into their embrace. And then she felt it, the painting. Its presence was like a heartbeat, pulsing in the darkness, drawing her toward it. She saw flashes of it in her mind, the twisted forest, the looming figure, her own terrified face staring back at her. The painting was a doorway, a conduit for this nightmare realm, and it was pulling her into its core. No, she cried, thrashing against the pull. I won't let you win. I won't. Her words were cut off as the shadows consumed her completely. For a moment, there was only silence. Then she opened her eyes. She was standing in her apartment again. The familiar walls and furniture surrounded her, bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she was free, but then she noticed the changes. The air was wrong, too still, too heavy. The colors of the room were muted, as though drained of life. And the painting was back, hanging on the wall in its usual spot. Its frame was darker now, almost black, and the image it held was different. It was her. She stood in the center of the painted scene, her face frozen in a look of terror. Behind her, the figure loomed, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The shadows in the painting seemed to move, shifting and writhing as though alive. Anna stared at the painting, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but her body wouldn't move. The pull of the painting was stronger now, its presence dominating the room. She could feel it seeping into her, wrapping around her mind like chains. Her phone buzzed, the sound startling her out of her paralysis. She looked down, her hands trembling as she picked it up. The screen displayed a single message. Welcome home. Anna dropped the phone, her hands trembling as it clattered onto the floor. The words on the screen burned in her mind. Welcome home. It felt like a mockery, as though the painting itself was laughing at her. The air around her felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight that pressed down on her chest. She staggered back, unable to take her eyes off the painting. The image was shifting again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the scene in the frame began to change. The forest behind her figure grew darker, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. The shadows around the painted version of herself thickened, creeping closer to her as if alive. And the figure, the hollow-eyed entity, stepped forward in the painting, its skeletal hand reaching for her painted shoulder. No, Anna whispered, shaking her head. No, no, no. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to think, tried to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't just stand there and watch. She had to do something. Anything. Without thinking, she grabbed a chair from the dining table and hurled it at the painting with all her strength. The impact was deafening. The chair shattered against the wall, the pieces scattering across the room. But the painting remained untouched, hanging there as if nothing had happened. Not a scratch, not a crack in the glass. It was as though it were mocking her attempts to destroy it. Anna let out a frustrated scream, grabbing a broken chair leg from the floor. She ran at the painting, wielding the makeshift weapon like a club. She struck it over and over, her arms aching as she poured all her fear and anger into the blows. But it was no use. The painting refused to break. "Why won't you break?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Why won't you just let me go?" The room felt colder now, the temperature plummeting with each passing second. Her breath formed visible puffs in the air, and frost began to creep along the edges of the walls. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, stretching toward her like reaching hands. And then, the whispering began again. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of her ragged breathing. But it grew louder, filling the room with its haunting chorus. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language she couldn't understand, their tones laced with malice and dread. Anna backed away from the painting, clutching the broken chair leg like a lifeline. "Stay away from me," she muttered, her voice trembling. "Stay away." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from inside her own head. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, surrounding her, suffocating her. And then, one voice rose above the rest. It was deep and guttural, resonating in her chest like a drumbeat. "You cannot escape." Anna froze, her body paralyzed with fear. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, gathering in the corners and stretching along the floor. They moved with purpose, swirling and writhing like living things. Slowly, they began to take shape, forming a dark, humanoid figure that towered over her. It was the entity from the painting. Its hollow eyes stared down at her, their emptiness pulling at her soul. The figure raised a hand, its long, skeletal fingers pointing directly at her. The whispers stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. "You belong to me now," the figure said, its voice echoing through the room. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "I don't. You can't have me." The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. The shadows around it reached out, curling toward her like tendrils. Anna backed away, her heart pounding. She had to think of something, some way to fight back. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze fell on the fireplace, where a single matchbook sat on the mantel. Without hesitation, she lunged for it, snatching it up in trembling hands. She struck a match, the tiny flame flickering to life in the dim room. The figure paused, its hollow eyes narrowing slightly. Anna didn't wait. She grabbed the nearest piece of fabric, a throw blanket from the couch, and held it over the flame. It caught fire quickly, the flames spreading across the fabric in seconds. With a scream of defiance, she threw the burning blanket at the painting. The flames licked at the edges of the frame, crawling across the canvas. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the painting began to scream. It was a horrible, inhuman sound, a chorus of voices wailing in agony. The shadows in the room recoiled, writhing as though in pain. The figure staggered back, its form flickering like a dying flame. The painting buckled and warped, the image within it distorting as the fire consumed it. Anna watched in horrified fascination as the painting twisted and cracked. The screaming grew louder, the voices blending into a deafening roar. The figure let out a final, guttural cry before collapsing into a swirl of shadows, which dissolved into nothingness. And then it was over. The painting crumbled into ash, the frame falling to the floor with a dull thud. The room was silent once more, the air still and heavy. Anna stood there, her chest heaving, the matchbook still clutched in her trembling hand. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the pile of ash on the floor. Minutes? Hours? Time felt meaningless. Finally, she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was gone. The painting was gone. And she was free. Or so she thought. From the corner of the room, a faint whisper broke the silence. "You cannot destroy what you are." Anna's heart stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with fear. In the shadows of the corner, something moved. A new painting began to take shape. its edges forming out of the darkness. The frame was black, the canvas empty, and then slowly an image began to appear. It was Anna, but this time she was smiling. Anna stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked on the new painting. Her image on the canvas wasn't like the terrified reflections she'd seen before. The woman in the painting stood tall, her head slightly tilted, lips curled in a cold, knowing smile. Behind her, the shadows twisted into shapes, indistinct figures with hollow eyes, watching, waiting. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head as the air seemed to constrict around her. "This isn't real. It's not real." But even as she said it, she could feel the pull again. The painting was alive, its presence seeping into the walls, the floors, the air itself. The room grew darker, the shadows creeping toward her like spilled ink. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around for an escape. Her phone buzzed on the floor. She hesitated, then snatched it up with shaking hands. Another message glowed on the screen. "Turn around." Anna's breath hitched. She refused to look. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay still, to keep her back pressed against the wall. But the shadows weren't waiting for her decision. They moved faster now, slithering like living things, wrapping around her ankles and pulling at her wrists. "Let me go," she screamed, struggling against the invisible force. "I destroyed it. I ended this." Her cries were met with silence, except for the faint rustle of shadows closing in. Desperation surged through her veins as she clawed at the encroaching darkness. She tried to think of the fire, the moment of victory, but deep down she knew. She hadn't won. She had only awakened something deeper. The painting's surface rippled, like a disturbed pool of black water. The image of her smiling self tilted its head further, as if acknowledging her struggle. Then the figure on the canvas moved. Anna froze, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. The painted version of herself stepped forward, the edges of the canvas warping, as though they were no longer bound by the frame. The shadows thickened, and Anna realized, with dawning horror, that the figure wasn't stepping out of the painting. It was pulling her in. "No," she screamed, twisting and kicking as the force dragged her closer to the wall. Her nails scraped against the floorboards, leaving deep grooves in the wood. "I won't go. You can't make me." The shadows tightened around her, lifting her off the ground. Her struggles grew weaker as the weight of the darkness pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. The painting loomed closer, the smiling figure growing larger, more vivid. She could see every detail now, the glint in its eyes, the cruel curve of its lips. "There is no escape," the figure's voice echoed in her mind, layered and distorted, as if 1,000 voices spoke as one. Anna's fingers clawed at the air, reaching for anything to hold on to. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into darkness. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the canvas was her own reflection in the painting, smiling back at her with that same chilling expression. When Anna opened her eyes, she was in the forest again. The oppressive shadows surrounded her, the twisted trees reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. But this time it was worse. The air buzzed with a low, malevolent hum, and the ground beneath her feet shifted as though alive. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. A familiar voice answered, its tone smooth and taunting. "Home." She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just the forest from the painting. It was the painting. She was inside it. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. I'll wake up. I have to wake up." But the forest didn't fade. Instead, it grew darker, the shadows pressing closer with each passing second. The trees seemed to whisper as they swayed, their voices a maddening chorus that burrowed into her mind. From the corner of her eye, Anna saw movement. She turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was her, but not her. The other Anna, the smiling version from the painting, watched her with an unblinking stare. "What do you want?" Anna demanded, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure tilted its head, mimicking the gesture from the painting. "You wanted to see. And now, you'll never stop seeing." With that, the other Anna stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as though she had never been there. The forest grew silent again, but the weight of her presence lingered. Anna stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get out. There had to be a way. She remembered the fire, the moment when she had nearly destroyed the painting. If she could recreate that, if she could find something to burn, maybe she could escape. The thought gave her a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished. The forest was endless, and everything she touched felt wrong. Too damp, too cold, too alive. Even the bark of the trees seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, as if the entire place was watching her. As she moved deeper into the forest, the whispers returned. They followed her, growing louder with every step. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, fragmented and nonsensical, but each one laced with malice. "Stay. Forever. Ours." Anna covered her ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head now, rooting themselves in her thoughts. Her pace quickened, her footsteps uneven as she stumbled over the uneven ground. And then she saw it. Up ahead, in a small clearing, stood an easel. On it was a blank canvas, pristine and untouched. A palette of colors sat on the ground beside it, along with a single paintbrush. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. She didn't want to go near it, but her feet moved on their own. The pull was irresistible, like a magnet drawing her closer. When she reached the easel, her hands trembled as she picked up the brush. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows around her thickened, pressing against her like a suffocating fog. "Paint," the voices commanded. "No," Anna said, her voice cracking. "I won't. You can't make me." But her hand moved anyway, guided by an unseen force. The brush dipped into the colors, and her arm swept across the canvas in fluid, deliberate motions. She tried to resist, but it was no use. Her body was no longer her own. As the image on the canvas took shape, Anna felt a sinking dread in her chest. It was her again, the smiling version, but this time, the figure was stepping out of the shadows, its hand reaching toward her. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't just painting, she was creating, and whatever she created would become real. Anna's fingers trembled as the brush moved across the canvas, each stroke more deliberate, more unnatural than the last. She could feel it, an energy coursing through her arm, compelling her to create. The figure on the canvas grew clearer with every pass of the brush, its face sharper, its eyes darker. She could see the smirk now, the same cruel smile she'd seen before. "Stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please stop." But the brush didn't falter. It swept across the canvas in fluid motions, as though driven by a will of its own. The forest around her seemed to close in, the shadows pressing closer, suffocating her. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind, urging her on. "Finish it." "No," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to. I won't." Her body didn't listen. The brush dipped into the darkest shade on the palette, and her hand moved to paint the figure's outstretched hand, the bony fingers reaching toward the edge of the canvas. The moment the hand was complete, the forest fell silent. For a moment, Anna thought it was over. She stared at the painting, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The figure on the canvas was fully formed now, its eyes locking with hers in an unblinking stare. The silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a heavy weight. And then, the canvas began to ripple. It started at the edges, the painted surface quivering like water disturbed by a single drop. The ripples spread outward, distorting the image as the figure seemed to shift and move. Anna staggered back, dropping the brush as the painted figure's hand pushed through the canvas. "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." The figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each step echoing in the stillness of the forest. The shadows seemed to follow it, clinging to its form like a second skin. Anna stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stay away from me," she screamed, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. It reached out a hand, its long fingers stretching toward her. Anna turned and ran, her feet pounding against the uneven ground. The forest blurred around her, the trees twisting and writhing as though alive. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us." Anna's lungs burned as she sprinted through the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. The shadows seemed to chase her, the air growing colder with every step. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The figure was there, only a few feet behind her, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. The forest itself seemed to shift and bend around it, bringing it closer to her with every passing moment. "No!" Anna screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone." She tripped over a root, crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. Her hands scraped against the rough earth, and she scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. But it was too late. The figure was standing over her now, its shadowy form towering above her. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, deafening roar. The figure reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against her shoulder. Anna screamed as a wave of darkness engulfed her. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the forest. She was back in her living room. The air was still, the room bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw it. The painting was back. It hung on the wall, pristine and untouched. The figure in the painting was gone, leaving the canvas blank. But as Anna stared at it, a new image began to take shape. Slowly, a figure appeared on the canvas. It was her. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was frozen in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows in the painting seemed to shift and move, swirling around her painted form like living things. Anna backed away, her hands trembling. She knew she couldn't escape. The painting was a part of her now, a curse she could never break. As she stared at her painted self, the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper. And in the silence, she heard the whispers return, soft and mocking. "You cannot destroy what you are." Anna's knees buckled as the whispers clawed at her mind, their cruel words embedding themselves like splinters. She fell to the floor, her gaze fixed on the shifting painting. Her likeness in the canvas writhed, the painted figure twisting and contorting as if in unbearable pain. She pressed her hands to her ears, rocking back and forth. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony in her head. "Please just stop." The whispers quieted for a moment, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Anna looked up, her breath caught in her throat as the painted version of herself turned its head, its eyes locking with hers. The figure's lips moved, forming a single word: "Run." The lights in the room flickered violently before plunging into complete darkness. Anna scrambled to her feet, fumbling for her phone, but it slipped from her hands and skidded under the couch. She stumbled forward blindly, her hands outstretched to find her bearings. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the shadows had substance. A faint glow emerged from the painting, illuminating the room in an eerie, unnatural light. The canvas was no longer blank. The forest had returned, its twisted trees stretching toward the edges of the frame. But this time, the painting didn't confine the scene. The forest seemed to bleed out, the edges of the canvas warping and dissolving into her living room. "No," Anna breathed, backing away. This isn't real. It can't be real. The floor beneath her feet changed, the smooth wood replaced by damp, uneven earth. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The walls of her home melted away, replaced by the towering, skeletal trees of the forest. Not again, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please, not again. She turned to run, but the forest shifted around her, the trees closing in like prison bars. The ground pulsed beneath her feet, alive with a slow, rhythmic thrum that resonated in her chest. She couldn't escape. She could feel it in her bones. This time, the forest wouldn't let her go. From the corner of her eye, Anna caught movement. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct and flickering like static. They surrounded her, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Stay back!" Anna screamed, her voice raw. She grabbed a branch from the ground, wielding it like a weapon. "I'm not afraid of you." But the figures didn't stop. They moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring her fear. One of them stepped forward, its face twisting into a grotesque imitation of a smile. "It's time," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo. "Time for what?" Anna demanded, her grip tightening on the branch. "To finish what you started." The ground beneath her feet began to split, jagged cracks spreading outward like veins. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the forest, shaking the trees and sending birds screeching into the sky. The figures stepped back, their eyes fixed on the ground. Anna stumbled as the earth beneath her gave way, opening into a gaping void. She screamed as she fell, her body plunging into the darkness. The air rushed past her, cold and biting, as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You belong to us." When Anna hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from her lungs. She lay there, dazed and gasping, the whispers fading into a low hum. The ground beneath her was cold and hard, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp stone. She opened her eyes and froze. She was in a cavern, its walls slick with moisture and pulsating faintly, as though alive. Strange symbols glowed faintly on the walls, their meanings incomprehensible but deeply unsettling. In the center of the cavern stood an easel, identical to the one she had seen in the forest. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this. I won't." The cavern seemed to respond, the walls trembling as a low growl echoed through the space. The easel stood unmoving, waiting. Anna felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging her toward the canvas. She dug her heels into the ground, resisting with every ounce of strength she had. "You can't make me," she screamed. "I won't do it." But the pull was relentless. It dragged her forward, her nails scraping against the stone floor as she fought to break free. When she reached the easel, her hand shot out involuntarily, grabbing the brush. "No!" Anna sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Please let me go." Her hand moved on its own, dipping the brush into the paint and sweeping it across the canvas. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter with each stroke, filling the cavern with an otherworldly light. As the image on the canvas took shape, Anna felt her strength draining away. She could see the painting now, a figure standing in the center of the forest, surrounded by shadows. The figure was her, but it wasn't the Anna she knew. It was the smiling version, her face twisted into a cruel, triumphant grin. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a deafening roar. The cavern trembled, the walls cracking and splitting as the light from the symbols grew blinding. Anna dropped the brush, her body collapsing to the ground as the painting began to ripple and distort. The smiling figure stepped out of the canvas, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. It towered over Anna, its presence suffocating. "You are no longer needed," it said, its voice cold and final. Anna tried to crawl away, but the shadows closed in, wrapping around her limbs and pulling her back. She screamed as the figure reached down, its hand closing around her throat. The last thing Anna saw was her own reflection in the figure's hollow eyes. And then there was nothing. Anna awoke to the sound of silence. Her body felt weightless, her surroundings dark and unyielding. She blinked, trying to make sense of where she was, but her vision wouldn't adjust. There was no light, no sound, only an endless, oppressive void. Then faintly she heard it, a soft, rhythmic dripping, as if water were falling onto stone. The sound grew louder, echoing in the emptiness, each drop carving into her mind. Panic rose within her as she tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were submerged in thick tar. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. It didn't echo, didn't carry, as if the void had swallowed her words whole. A faint glow appeared in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. Desperate for any sense of direction, Anna focused on it, willing her body to move. Inch by inch, she dragged herself toward the light, her breaths shallow and labored. As she drew closer, she saw the glow wasn't fire, it was the canvas. The painting stood alone in the void, its surface alive with shifting images. The forest flickered into view, the skeletal trees twisting and writhing. Then it was her living room, the walls cracked and distorted. And finally, it settled on an image of herself, standing in the very void she now inhabited. "No," Anna whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm done. I'm done." But the painting didn't relent. Her reflection stared back at her, its expression a mix of pity and disdain. The whispers returned, soft at first, then rising in a crescendo of voices, overlapping and intertwining. "You are a part of us now. There is no escape." The Anna in the painting began to move, stepping forward, closer to the edge of the canvas. Her face twisted into a smile, the same cruel, mocking grin that had haunted Anna from the beginning. As the painted figure stepped out of the frame, Anna felt an unbearable pull, like her soul was being wrenched from her body. "No!" she screamed, clawing at the void, trying to resist. But the pull was unstoppable. She was dragged forward, her body dissolving into fragments of light and shadow. The last thing she saw was her painted double, standing tall and serene, watching her with cold, unblinking eyes. And then she was inside. The whispers stopped. The void was gone. Anna was back in her living room, but it wasn't hers anymore. The air felt wrong, thick and stifling, filled with an unnatural stillness. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. She realized with dawning horror that she wasn't in her body. She was in the painting. Through her frozen eyes, she saw the world outside the frame. The shadows in the room danced and flickered, alive with the same malevolent energy that had consumed her. And then she saw it, a woman stepping into the room. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She stared at the canvas, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. Anna tried to scream, to warn the woman, but no sound escaped. The whispers began again, wrapping around the woman like a siren's call. "Come closer," they urged. "Look deeper." The woman hesitated, her hand reaching out toward the canvas. Anna's painted reflection smiled against her will, the same cruel smile she had seen so many times before. The cycle had begun again. Name of the next story, The Grinning Man. It started with a feeling, a strange, unsettling sensation that crawled beneath the skin, like someone watching from just out of view. People dismissed it at first, chalking it up to nerves or overactive imaginations. But soon, it became clear that something was wrong, something terrifying. The first person to encounter him was Emily Harris. She was an ordinary woman, living in a small apartment in the city. A late-night jogger, she'd often find herself running along the quiet streets after work, enjoying the calm of the evening. It was during one of these runs, about a mile from her apartment, that she first noticed him. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a man passing by in the shadows of an alleyway. She barely caught a glimpse of him, but what struck her was his smile. It was wide, unnaturally so. His mouth stretched from ear to ear, and the smile was wrong. It didn't match the rest of his face. It was too big, too sharp, almost as though it didn't belong there. Emily brushed it off, telling herself it was nothing. People smiled all the time, right? But when she looked again, he was still there, just standing at the edge of the street. His grin had only widened, the edges of his lips curling upward in a grotesque display. She quickened her pace, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. Her footsteps echoed in the empty streets, but when she glanced over her shoulder, there was no one there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. She felt it, his presence, lurking just out of her line of sight. When she turned a corner and entered the safety of her apartment complex, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's face, his grin. It was burned into her mind, too vivid to forget. She tried to brush it off as a bad dream, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next day, she didn't think much of it. She went to work, talked to her friends, and tried to go about her routine. But every time she turned a corner or entered a new room, she had the distinct feeling that someone was standing just behind her. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence, lurking, waiting. It happened again the following night. Emily was running, just as she had the night before, but this time, the feeling was stronger. She was no longer alone on the streets. The sound of her footsteps seemed to be joined by something else, faint, almost imperceptible, like the echo of someone walking behind her. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. There he was again, the same man, standing in the distance, his face still obscured by shadows. But his grin was unmistakable, his smile growing wider as she watched him. The same feeling she had last night returned, that sense of something watching her. Only now it was clear, it was him. The next morning, Emily called in sick to work. She couldn't shake the image of the man's grin, or the feeling that he was following her, waiting for the right moment. Her mind began to unravel, filled with thoughts of the man and his unblinking stare. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't rid herself of the sense of dread. It gnawed at her every time she entered a room, every time she turned her back. The smile was always there, lurking in the corner of her vision. That's when the dreams began. At first, it was just the same as before. The man with the too wide grin standing at the end of the street, staring at her from the shadows. But as the nights went on, the dreams grew more vivid, more intense. In them, he wasn't just standing anymore. He was following her, his grin stretching, growing, as he slowly got closer. His eyes never blinked, never moved. It was as if he was watching her soul, drawing closer with every step. In one dream, she was walking through a dark hallway, the walls closing in on her. She could hear her breath echoing in the empty space. When she turned the corner, he was there, standing at the end of the hallway waiting. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, unable to escape. The man's grin widened until his mouth was a grotesque, unnatural stretch of flesh. "Help me," she screamed in the dream, but no sound came out. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still feel his presence, lingering in the room with her. The grin was in her mind, and it was real. She knew it now. The man was real, and he was getting closer. It started with a feeling, a strange, unsettling sensation that crawled beneath the skin, like someone watching from just out of view. People dismissed it at first, chalking it up to nerves or overactive imaginations. But soon it became clear that something was wrong, something terrifying. The first person to encounter him was Emily Harris. She was an ordinary woman, living in a small apartment in the city. A late-night jogger, she'd often find herself running along the quiet streets after work, enjoying the calm of the evening. It was during one of these runs, about a mile from her apartment, that she first noticed him. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a man passing by in the shadows of an alleyway. She barely caught a glimpse of him, but what struck her was his smile. It was wide, unnaturally so. His mouth stretched from ear to ear, and the smile was wrong. It didn't match the rest of his face. It was too big, too sharp, almost as though it didn't belong there. Emily brushed it off, telling herself it was nothing. People smiled all the time, right? But when she looked again, he was still there, just standing at the edge of the street. His grin had only widened, the edges of his lips curling upward in a grotesque display. She quickened her pace, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. Her footsteps echoed in the empty streets, but when she glanced over her shoulder, there was no one there. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. She felt it, his presence, lurking just out of her line of sight. When she turned a corner and entered the safety of her apartment complex, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's face, his grin. It was burned into her mind, too vivid to forget. She tried to brush it off as a bad dream, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next day, she didn't think much of it. She went to work, talked to her friends, and tried to go about her routine. But every time she turned a corner or entered a new room, she had the distinct feeling that someone was standing just behind her. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their presence, lurking, waiting. It happened again the following night. Emily was running, just as she had the night before, but this time the feeling was stronger. She was no longer alone on the streets. The sound of her footsteps seemed to be joined by something else, faint, almost imperceptible, like the echo of someone walking behind her. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. There he was again, the same man, standing in the distance, his face still obscured by shadows. But his grin was unmistakable, his smile growing wider as she watched him. The same feeling she had last night returned, that sense of something watching her. Only now it was clear, it was him. The next morning, Emily called in sick to work. She couldn't shake the image of the man's grin, or the feeling that he was following her, waiting for the right moment. Her mind began to unravel, filled with thoughts of the man and his unblinking stare. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't rid herself of the sense of dread. It gnawed at her every time she entered a room, every time she turned her back. The smile was always there, lurking in the corner of her vision. That's when the dreams began. At first, it was just the same as before. The man with the too wide grin standing at the end of the street, staring at her from the shadows. But as the nights went on, the dreams grew more vivid, more intense. In them, he wasn't just standing anymore. He was following her, his grin stretching, growing, as he slowly got closer. His eyes never blinked, never moved. It was as if he was watching her soul, drawing closer with every step. In one dream, she was walking through a dark hallway, the walls closing in on her. She could hear her breath echoing in the empty space. When she turned the corner, he was there, standing at the end of the hallway waiting. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, unable to escape. The man's grin widened until his mouth was a grotesque, unnatural stretch of flesh. "Help me," she screamed in the dream, but no sound came out. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still feel his presence, lingering in the room with her. The grin was in her mind, and it was real. She knew it now. The man was real, and he was getting closer. Emily wasn't the only one. Across town, there were reports of strange sightings, people experiencing the same thing. A man with an unnatural grin, standing just at the edge of their vision. At first, the reports were dismissed as paranoia or collective delusion. But as more and more people came forward, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't long before the city was on edge. People began to avoid the streets at night, and whispers of the grinning man spread like wildfire. He wasn't a figment of imagination or a figment of folklore. He was real, and his presence was growing. People began to report seeing him during the day as well, always in their peripheral vision. They'd turn, and he'd be gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. It was as if he was always just out of sight, always just beyond reach. And then, the grinning man became bolder. Sarah Turner, a journalist for the local news, began to investigate the growing urban legend of the grinning man. She had heard the stories, of course, but she didn't believe in such things. Not at first. She figured it was just a case of mass hysteria, of people's minds playing tricks on them. But when she started hearing first-hand accounts from people she knew, friends, family, even her own colleagues, she began to wonder if there was something more to it. She decided to conduct an experiment to see if there was any truth to the claims. One evening, she walked along the city streets, her camera in hand, hoping to catch something on film. The air was thick with tension, the streets unusually quiet. The city felt like it was holding its breath. She walked for an hour, her eyes darting to the shadows, searching for any sign of the grinning man. Nothing. No strange figures. No eerie smiles. Just the usual empty streets. But as she made her way home, she saw him. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned, but there was nothing there. She took a few more steps, and then she saw him again. This time, his smile was unmistakable. Wide. Too wide. His eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, and his grin stretched further, as though it were growing. Sarah froze. The man was just standing there, across the street, his grin stretching wider with each passing second. She reached for her camera, but her hands shook too much to get a good shot. She took a step back, then another. Her heart thudded in her chest as she tried to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. The grin was everywhere. It was in the corner of her vision, in the shadows, in her thoughts. She couldn't escape it, and then the city began to change. People weren't just seeing him anymore. They were hearing him. His voice was low, a whisper that seemed to echo inside their minds. It was always the same words, repeated over and over. "Smile for me." At first, it was subtle, a faint whisper, barely audible. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder. They followed people everywhere, at work, at home, on the street. It was inescapable. It drove them mad. Sarah's mind was unraveling, the words echoing louder and louder with each passing second. "Smile for me." It was all she could hear, all she could think. Her eyes darted around the empty street, but the grinning man was nowhere to be seen. She ran home, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it, trying to shake the image from her mind. But it was there, lingering in the corners of her vision. Every time she moved, it felt as though something was following her, something just outside her line of sight. His presence, that unbearable grin, was never far away. She dropped her camera to the floor and collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling. The whispers didn't stop. They swirled in her mind, louder now, filling every corner of her consciousness. "Smile for me." Her head spun, the weight of his voice pushing down on her. She clutched her head, trying to block out the sound. But it wouldn't stop. It never stopped. Then it happened. The smile appeared in her peripheral vision, stretched wide and horrifying, just like all the others had described. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. She could see him clearly, standing in her living room doorway, his grin widening impossibly, stretching across his face like some grotesque, inhuman thing. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward him. But when she did, he was gone. He always was. The smile, though, stayed. It lingered in the room like a shadow, a reminder that he was there. The walls around her seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The room spun, and Sarah fought to stay conscious, to maintain some semblance of control. But she felt her thoughts slip away, lost to the whispers that filled her mind. The grinning man had come for her, and there was no escaping him. Across town, Emily Harris was beginning to lose her grip on reality. She had locked herself in her apartment for days, unable to go outside, unable to escape the haunting presence that stalked her. It was like the world was closing in around her, and she couldn't breathe. The smile was everywhere, behind her, in the corner of her vision, always lurking just out of sight. Her once bright and tidy apartment now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to press in on her, and the windows, once sources of comfort and light, now felt like barriers trapping her inside. It had been nearly a week since she had last left her apartment. She hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't answered her phone. She couldn't. Every time she tried to speak, she heard his voice, low, whispering, echoing in her skull. "Smile for me." The words burned into her brain, a constant, maddening refrain. She had tried everything, locking the doors, turning off the lights, even covering the windows with heavy blankets. But nothing worked. The smile always found its way in. And then, one night, as she lay in bed, something changed. The whispering stopped. For the first time in days, she felt quiet. The room was still. The air was still. It was almost peaceful. But as she closed her eyes, ready to drift into sleep, she felt it, the familiar presence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her heart skipped a beat. He was here. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The darkness in her room seemed deeper now, the shadows stretching longer than they should. The air felt heavier. She could feel him standing at the foot of her bed. The grinning man was there. His smile was impossibly wide, stretching past his ears, distorting his face into something grotesque. His eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, were locked on her. And this time, he wasn't in her peripheral vision. No, this time, he was staring at her directly, his grin widening, impossibly more and more. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped, caught in her throat. The room began to spin, the walls closing in around her. His grin stretched, growing wider and wider still, until it seemed to fill the entire room. And then a voice. "Smile for me, Emily." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a faint echo. It was right in her ear. The words were clear, cutting through the air, freezing her blood in her veins. And then the smile grew even wider, impossibly large, until it was all she could see, all she could feel. The last thing Emily Harris saw was the grin. The grinning man wasn't just in Emily's life. He was in everyone's life now. As more and more people began to speak out, the city began to panic. The urban legend, once dismissed as nothing more than a ghost story, had become a reality. People couldn't sleep, couldn't function. The whispers followed them, driving them to the brink of madness. It wasn't just the sight of him anymore, it was the voice too. "Smile for me." It echoed in their minds, in their thoughts, in their dreams. It wasn't long before the news outlets began to report mass hysteria. Hospitals were flooded with patients, people who were so broken by the experience that they could barely speak, barely think. Some had gone mute entirely, unable to form words. Others had simply disappeared, their homes left untouched, the only sign of their existence being the lingering sound of that smile. A dark cloud hung over the city, and soon, the authorities started to acknowledge the growing problem. But they were powerless. The grinning man wasn't something they could contain. He was everywhere. People who had seen him, those who were brave enough to speak, began to show signs of madness. Some would smile uncontrollably, their faces stretching into those grotesque, unholy grins. Others would lock themselves away, refusing to go outside. The city became a shell of itself, with people hiding behind locked doors, whispering rumors of the man who haunted them. And then came the final breaking point. One evening, a group of people gathered in a small, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. They had heard of others who might know how to stop the grinning man. Desperation led them to one another, and they spoke of rituals, of ancient legends, of ways to banish the thing that had plagued them all. But as they sat in the darkness, chanting words that didn't make sense, they heard it, the same whisper. "Smile for me." It came from every direction. It echoed off the walls. The doors slammed shut. And in the corner of the room, there he was, standing just out of sight. His grin stretched wider and wider, filling the entire room. And then the whispers stopped. All that remained was the smile. The room grew silent, heavy with dread. No one spoke, no one moved. The grinning man was everywhere and nowhere all at once, his presence a suffocating weight in the air. His smile stretched and spread, as if it were the very essence of the room itself. The walls seemed to bend and warp around the grotesque curve of his lips, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world was folding in on itself. The people in the room began to tremble, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Some had already fallen to their knees, their faces pale and twisted with fear. Their eyes darted around, looking for an escape that would never come. And then a voice broke the silence, a raspy, desperate whisper that filled the room. "Please, no more, stop." It was a woman, her face twisted in agony, her lips trembling as she spoke. But the grinning man didn't respond. He didn't need to. His smile only grew, wider still, until it consumed her entire field of vision. It was like a storm of horror, swirling with malice and hunger. Suddenly, one of the men in the group screamed. His hands shot up to his face, clawing at his skin, as though trying to tear away the very image of the smile that was embedded in his mind. But no matter how hard he clawed, it remained, his own face now contorting into an impossible grin. "Stop, please," he cried, his voice breaking. But the smile never faltered. It stretched further, deeper, until his lips split, his mouth an open wound that bled and bled. His eyes were wide, his pupils lost, staring at something unseen. The other people in the room backed away, eyes wide with terror. Some were frozen in place, unable to look away from the horror that had consumed their friend. Others tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open. They tried to scream, but their voices were drowned out by the laughter that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It wasn't just the grinning man anymore. It was the fear he had cultivated, the madness he had sown. He wasn't just a figure in their vision, he had become a force, a malevolent presence that twisted their minds, drove them to madness, and now, it seemed, he was feeding on it. The woman who had whispered earlier, her voice now barely a croak, began to chant, almost involuntarily, as though something deep within her was trying to resist. Smile for me, she repeated, over and over again, as though it was the only thing left she could do. But her voice was cracking, and with each word, her eyes grew more distant, as though she too were slipping away. The grinning man hadn't moved an inch, yet his presence seemed to engulf everything. It was as if time had stopped, the moment stretching into eternity, a never-ending loop of horror. And then, in a sudden flash, the room went black. When the lights flickered back on, no one spoke. The building was eerily still, and the oppressive silence that filled the air was more suffocating than the chaos that had just erupted. But something had changed. The group that had gathered to fight the grinning man, if that's what they'd truly been trying to do, was gone. In their place, only one person remained, a man standing in the center of the room. His eyes were wide, staring ahead blankly. His face was a mirror of what had happened to the others. His lips stretched unnaturally into a grotesque grin, wide enough that his cheeks were splitting at the edges. He had become like them, like the others who had already fallen to the grinning man's power. "Smile for me," the man whispered softly, his voice hollow, as though his very soul had been consumed. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the horror that had taken root in the city. People went about their daily lives, but in their peripheral vision he was there, just out of sight, waiting. The grinning man had already claimed their minds, and they didn't even know it. It wasn't just one city anymore. It was everywhere. The grinning man was everywhere. His presence had spread like a virus, infecting not just the minds of those who saw him, but entire communities, entire regions, until the entire country seemed to be consumed by the eerie whisper. "Smile for me." And in the quietest hours of the night, when the city was wrapped in darkness, there were those who looked out their windows and saw him standing just outside. A figure in the distance, his face obscured by shadows, but his grin, always that damnable grin, was unmistakable. The whispers followed them into their homes. It was in the walls, in their thoughts, in their hearts. It became a part of them, something so deeply ingrained that they could no longer separate it from the very essence of who they were. And as the days passed, more and more people were lost to it. They didn't know how to fight it. They didn't even know how it had begun. The grinning man had no clear origin. No one knew if he had always been there, lurking just beyond the veil, or if he had simply found a crack in the human psyche to slip through. Some whispered that the grinning man was a curse, a manifestation of collective fear and paranoia. Others believed he was something darker, a force that had always existed, waiting for the right moment to strike. But no one truly understood. All they knew was that once he found you, once you saw him, once you heard his whisper, there was no escape. And somewhere, in the deepest shadow of the night, the grinning man stood, watching, waiting, always smiling. And though he was not a physical presence to be held or fought, his grip on the world was stronger than any tangible force. Because the true horror of the grinning man was not the smile. It was the madness he spread, the darkness he awakened, the terror that lived in the minds of those who couldn't escape it. And in the end, that was enough. It seemed that no one could escape the curse of the grinning man. No one could avoid the slow, creeping madness that wrapped itself around their thoughts. Even those who tried to fight it, tried to understand it, were doomed. The whispers always found them, always crept into their minds at the most vulnerable moments. The city had changed. People no longer smiled out of joy, but out of fear. It became a ritual, a defensive mechanism. If you smiled, perhaps it would keep the grinning man away. But the smiles grew strained, hollow, as though the people could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what was a facade. For months, life had continued like this. People lived in quiet terror, watching the shadows and waiting for the next person to disappear, to be claimed by the smile. They had grown numb to it, but that numbness was a kind of survival. It was the only way to keep living, to keep moving, even if it meant ignoring the monster that stalked them from the edges of their sight. But then a new report surfaced. This time, it wasn't another case of someone driven to madness, someone who had vanished without a trace. No, this time there was a breakthrough. A woman named Claire Thomason, a psychologist, had come forward. She had spent the last few months researching the phenomenon, trying to understand what the grinning man truly was. She had studied the history of similar urban legends, poring over every scrap of information she could find. There had to be a way to stop it, she thought. There had to be something they could do. She began to document the experiences of those who had encountered the grinning man, compiling data, comparing patterns. She spoke to survivors, those few who hadn't completely lost their minds or disappeared. Each of them had one thing in common. They all saw him in their peripheral vision. They all heard his whisper. And they all described the smile, the impossibly wide grin that was always there, lurking in the corners of their sight. But what stood out was this. The longer someone was exposed to the grinning man, the more real he became. It wasn't just an illusion, a trick of the mind. He was a tangible presence, something that could not be banished so easily. In her research, Claire began to theorize that the grinning man was tied to the very fabric of human fear. He wasn't just a monster, he was a manifestation of the collective dread of mankind. The more people feared him, the stronger he became. And once you saw him, once you acknowledged his presence, you were bound to him. There was no escape from the endless cycle, but there was hope. At least Claire believed so. She had come up with a plan, a risky one that would require the cooperation of those who had survived long enough to retain some shred of sanity. If they could confront the grinning man head-on, if they could make him real, make him tangible, perhaps they could break the cycle. Perhaps they could force him to reveal his true nature, expose the illusion, and destroy the curse. The problem, of course, was that no one was sure if they could control it. No one knew what would happen if they tried. The grinning man wasn't a mere figure that could be vanquished with simple tools or rituals. He was far more insidious than that. He was an idea, a fear, an unstoppable force. But Claire was desperate. She had seen the damage he caused. She had spoken to people who had been driven to the brink of madness, who had lost everything to his whispers and grins. She couldn't stand by and let it continue. Claire reached out to a group of survivors, people who had seen the grinning man and lived to tell the tale. They met in secret, planning their confrontation, knowing full well the risks they were taking. They gathered in an abandoned church at midnight, a place where the city's dark energy felt most concentrated. There, in the cold stone silence, they prepared. Claire had brought with her a series of strange symbols, markings she believed could bind the grinning man's power. Symbols that had been drawn from ancient rituals used to ward off malevolent forces. One by one, they took their positions, each survivor standing in a circle, holding candles that flickered weakly in the air. Claire stood at the center, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. They began to chant. At first, the words seemed to fade into the air, but soon they began to resonate, vibrating with a deep, unsettling power. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, the church's walls groaning as if the very building was alive. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as the air grew thick, oppressive. And then it happened. The lights in the church flickered. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward them like tendrils of darkness. A cold breeze whipped through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of a whisper. "Smile for me." The grinning man had come. But this time, he didn't appear in their peripheral vision. He was right there, standing in the center of the circle, grinning at them with that wide, impossible smile. His face was distorted, unnatural, his eyes hollow voids that swallowed the light. His grin stretched far beyond human proportions, like a wound that refused to heal. The survivors froze, their faces drained of color. Claire, however, kept her focus. She could feel the power of the symbols she had drawn, the ancient markings that surrounded them, pushing against the grinning man's presence. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The grinning man didn't move. He didn't need to. His very existence was enough to paralyze them. His smile grew wider still, and the walls of the church began to close in on them. The floor beneath their feet seemed to ripple, as though the very ground itself was twisting into a nightmare. The air felt thick with dread, oppressive, suffocating. But Claire didn't stop chanting. She refused to. And then something shifted. The ground beneath them cracked open, and the grinning man's grin began to distort. His form seemed to flicker, shifting between shadows and light. For the first time, he looked unsure. The smile wavered, like it was being pulled apart, like it couldn't hold its shape. Claire's heart raced. This was it. She pushed harder, chanting the ancient words with all her might, pouring every ounce of her energy into the symbols. The grinning man's smile twitched. The air in the church grew colder still, as if the very fabric of reality was thinning. Claire could feel the weight of the grinning man's gaze, though his eyes, black, empty voids, didn't seem to focus on anyone specifically. It was as if he were looking at everything, all at once, and yet nothing at all. His grin, once impossibly wide, now began to fray at the edges, like it was a mask slipping off. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed as if the very nature of his form was unraveling before their eyes, stretching and distorting in ways that defied logic. The survivors in the circle, their faces pale and terrified, couldn't look away. Claire continued chanting, her voice growing hoarse, but she didn't dare stop. She could feel it, feel the grinning man's strength faltering under the weight of the ancient symbols she had summoned. She had to keep him contained, keep him from fully manifesting. She knew that if he broke free, they would all be lost. But as she uttered the final syllable of the incantation, something snapped. The grinning man's body twisted violently, his form convulsing in unnatural angles. For a brief instant, he flickered like a faulty television screen, his body growing too large for the space, his smile cracking even further, revealing sharp, jagged teeth beneath the stretched skin. It was a grotesque, abominable sight, something beyond human understanding. And for a moment, Claire's heart stopped as she faced the true horror of what they had summoned. Then nothing. The room went deathly quiet. The grinning man was gone. Claire gasped for breath, her legs trembling beneath her. She had no idea what had just happened. Was he gone? Had the ritual worked? The survivors in the circle slowly lowered their candles, their hands shaking. No one spoke. They were too terrified to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. But as Claire scanned the room, she could see that the terror wasn't over. The atmosphere still felt heavy, the air thick with the lingering presence of something evil. But it wasn't just that. In the far corner of the room, by the broken stained glass window, something caught her eye. A reflection. The grinning man was there, standing in the glass, smiling. But this time, it wasn't a flicker or a shadow. He was solid, whole. His grin stretched wider than before, impossibly wide, until it seemed to consume the entire pane of glass. His eyes, empty, hollow, focused on Claire, and she felt a chill shoot up her spine as she met his gaze. It was him, the grinning man. The survivors screamed in unison, terror seizing their hearts. Claire stumbled backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the ancient symbols etched on the ground. But it was too late. The grinning man was already moving. He didn't need to walk. His smile stretched out toward them, the edges of his lips elongating, as though they were made of liquid darkness. It slithered across the room, faster than anything human. The survivors' screams were cut short as the grin enveloped them, swallowing them whole, until they were nothing more than distorted shadows trapped inside his smile. Claire tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the very air had thickened around her, holding her in place. She could feel it now, the grinning man's presence closing in on her, his laughter echoing through the walls, a sound that was both deafening and silent all at once. "Smile for me." The whisper was in her ear, so close, so suffocating, that she couldn't tell if it was real or if her mind had finally cracked. Her body began to tremble. Her eyes darted to the reflection in the glass, and there he was again, grinning, smiling, stretching wider and wider with every passing second. His face was everywhere now, and the more she looked, the more the room seemed to warp and distort. The church around her began to melt, the walls shifting like liquid, the floors turning into a soft, damp soil that clung to her feet. It wasn't the grinning man that was trapping her. It was herself. She had become part of the curse. She had summoned him, and now she was his. The room began to spin, the walls cracking and shifting into darkness. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone floor, but it wasn't stone anymore. It was something else, something that felt wet, like the skin of some massive creature. She could hear it breathing. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell. She fell into darkness, but not into nothingness. There was something below, something waiting. She could feel it, could hear its breath as it inched closer. Her heart pounded as she realized with cold dread that the darkness wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. And then, everything went silent. When Claire awoke, she wasn't in the church anymore. She was standing in an empty street, under the pale glow of a flickering streetlight. Her hands were trembling, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure how she had gotten here, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer in control. Her vision blurred as she looked around, the street stretching on infinitely in both directions. There was no sign of the church, no sign of the people she had been with. It was just her, alone, surrounded by the empty streets, the cold, hollow city. Then a voice, "Smile for me." It wasn't just a whisper this time. It was everywhere. The words came from all directions, bouncing off the walls, the streetlights, the buildings that seemed to stretch upward into nothingness. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as she looked around, panic rising in her chest. She wasn't alone. No one was. She turned, and there, standing at the end of the street, was the grinning man. His smile stretched impossibly wide, filling the entire width of the road. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, met hers, and for a moment, she couldn't look away. She couldn't move. The terror, the power of his presence was too overwhelming. And just like that, Claire understood. There was no escape. There never had been. The grinning man didn't need to follow you. He was already inside you. And as she stood there, frozen, her body trembling with fear, Claire realized that she too had become part of the legend, part of the curse. And the city, the world, was next. The street stretched endlessly, a maze of dim, flickering lights and darkened alleyways, and Claire could feel the weight of the grinning man's presence, not just before her, but all around her. It was as though his smile, now wrapping the entirety of the street in its sinister grip, was pulling the world itself into a twisted, suffocating reality. The whispers echoed, louder now, more urgent. "Smile for me." She tried to move, tried to tear her gaze away from the monstrous smile that now consumed the street, but it was as though her body had frozen in place. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world around her seemed to distort with every passing second, warping in a way that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. Her pulse quickened. The street around her felt narrower, the buildings pressing in on her from all sides. The streetlights, once calm and dim, now flickered in chaotic bursts, casting shadows that twisted and writhed as if alive. The walls of the city seemed to close in on her, pulsing, throbbing, alive with malevolent energy. The grinning man moved toward her slowly, his smile widening with each step he took. His presence felt oppressive, the very air thick with the scent of rot and decay. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her legs shaking beneath her, but still she couldn't move. "Smile for me, Claire." His voice, was louder now, closer, as if it was inside her mind, feeding off her fear. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out. She could feel his gaze even with her eyes shut, his presence burning through her thoughts like a fire. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She couldn't escape him. She couldn't escape herself. For a brief, fleeting moment, Claire thought of her old life, before the grinning man had come. She remembered the days when she had felt safe, when the world wasn't warped by shadows and madness. She thought of her family, her friends, if they were still out there, if they had been taken like the others. But no matter how much she tried to hold on to those memories, they began to slip away, fading into the darkness. Her past was being consumed, just like everything else. The grinning man stood before her now, impossibly close. His smile stretched across his face, splitting his features into something unrecognizable. His eyes, those hollow black voids, seemed to draw her in, sucking her deeper into the abyss of his gaze. "Smile for me," he whispered again, his voice a terrible, scraping sound that vibrated deep in her chest. She could feel it then, the shift. The grinning man wasn't just an entity she could escape. He was something that was part of her now. His presence had wormed its way into her mind, into her very being, and there was no separation between her and him anymore. Her lips trembled, and her body jerked as though fighting against the smile that was forcing its way onto her face. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but it was as if her very muscles were no longer her own. The smile stretched across her face, uncontrollable, unnatural. It felt like it would tear her apart from the inside. "Smile for me." The whisper was almost a command now, and Claire's vision blurred. The grin on her face felt like a wound, painful, stretching deeper, as though it were sewn into her very skin. Her teeth felt sharp, her mouth stretching far too wide, until it felt like it could never return to normal. The grinning man's face was the only thing that remained in her vision now, and her own reflection, twisted in his eyes, was all she could see. In that moment, Claire realized the truth. There was no escape. Her body had become part of his curse, part of his monstrous smile. He wasn't stalking her anymore. She had become him. Her body shook violently as the smile grew wider, impossibly wide, until her face felt like it might crack in two. Then, just as quickly, everything went silent. The world around her stopped. The city, the street, the shadows, they all paused. A new presence made itself known. It wasn't the grinning man that stood before her now. No, it was something darker, something more pervasive. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she realized, in horror, that she wasn't alone. There were others. Figures, shapes, emerged from the shadows, stepping into the flickering light. They weren't people, not anymore. They were twisted versions of themselves, faces stretched into grotesque grins, eyes hollow, and bodies contorted in unnatural angles. The city was full of them. The grinning man had taken them all. They were once victims, just like her, drawn in by his whisper, his smile. But now they were nothing more than extensions of his curse, trapped forever in the endless, looping nightmare he had created. Claire felt a cold hand grip her arm, pulling her toward the others. The figures circled around her, their smiles impossibly wide, their eyes black and empty. They whispered in unison, their voices a chorus of madness. "Smile for me, Claire." The words echoed in her mind, crashing through her thoughts, drowning her in terror. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity, her sense of self, becoming one with the curse. She was just another lost soul, caught in the endless cycle of terror and madness that the grinning man had created. And then, in the coldest of moments, the truth hit her. The grinning man wasn't a being. He wasn't just a creature of nightmares. He was a force that fed on fear, on despair. He was the embodiment of humanity's deepest, darkest fears. Every victim he took, every person he drove insane, only made him stronger. And in the end, they all became part of him. Claire felt the tug in her chest. It was the grinning man pulling at her soul, at her very essence. She couldn't fight it anymore. There was nothing left to fight for. With a final, horrible lurch, her body froze again. She felt the smile on her face grow wider, so wide it felt like her skin would rip. Her vision blurred, and the shadows around her deepened until they consumed her completely. The city, the streets, the figures, all of it became a blur, as if reality itself was collapsing into one singular nightmare. Claire's last thought, before she too was swallowed by the darkness, was a single, terrifying truth. There is no escape. The grinning man had won, and now he would never stop. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.